Okay. Josiah, how do I advance the slides, actually?
You just hit the arrow key on the keyboard.
Steve. Cart. That one. Okay. So Brazil. You speak Portuguese. Wonderful. It's really a privilege to be here in your midst. And it really is a learning community, as Karen said, and that's the expectation we share with each other. And we're based in Geneva most of the time, so we bring our greetings from Geneva, from the Christian community there, and the international NGO, UN, World Health Organization, et cetera, community in which we rub shoulders frequently. We recently were at the Christian Association for Psychological Studies conference in Dallas about 2 weeks ago, and there was a brilliant presentation on sex therapy. Okay, I said the S word, we have to get it in, and then we can get over it. But the two therapists said one of the best things if you want to work in sex therapy is to do a sex autobiography, your own sexual experiences, right? If you want to work well, effectively, look at transference, countertransference. So applying that to trauma, okay? To work effectively in trauma, why not do a trauma autobiography, your own history? So we're talking today, Michelle and I, about the macro picture of trauma, globally what's going on. But I would just want to start with our own souls and the importance of doing our own introspective work, trauma, through a trauma lens. And I know a lot of us are therapists or married to therapists, and so that is not unusual for us to want to look inward and understand ourselves. Proverbs 14:8, the wisdom of the prudent person is to understand his or her way. Folly of fools is to see. But let's think about that. Not now, we won't have time to get into it, but just a bug in our ears. Could we look at our own autobiography through a trauma lens and come back stronger and more skilled as a result, healthier as we work into trauma areas too? Interesting study, a little bit of research. Going back to 1999, a woman who, I don't know, maybe you know her, Joan Harder, I forgot what university she's associated with, but she looked at missionary stress. And she redid Dorothy Gish's classic study in 1983, Sources of Missionary Stress. And she used a similar checklist, but she added a few things. And one of the things she added in trying to get at missionary stress was see needs that I'm unable to meet. And in her sample, that was the greatest stressor, reported to have the greatest level of stress, on par with crossing culture and language boundaries and relational discord and relational issues. My point is this: as we talk about our experience, our lived experience, our involvement in trauma, we see a lot of needs that we're not able to meet. It is an existential experience for us, a challenge at the core of our being so often. When we see these needs, when we see trauma, when we see stuff like that. And I think I feel safe and I feel good about this group because in addition to all of our great skill sets and wisdom, which we all have, we also have this that unites us. We've seen the dark side of humanity and we're called to that dark side, and it's not easy. It is a drain on our souls. And I've so appreciated the last 2 days at Leanne and Bill's just being refreshed at their house and just sensing that they accept me. And that's been great. Trauma is a word which is overused. You stub your toe. Oh, that really traumatized me. Well, you're not going to say that. Burnout is a word that's overused. But it's also a word, and one of our main points is it's a word that's underused in the literature about the big picture, about what's causing and some of the consequences of the world's evils and the world's problems. So we're going to err on that side today, talking about how trauma is essentially underused, and we need to put a trauma lens on in our international work to be able to understand what's really going on in terms of its causes and in terms of its consequences. So in summary, my little salvo introduction, why not do a trauma autobiography? Just do a little trauma thing at some point in your life if you haven't done it. And the first thing that comes to my mind is promising God I would become a Roman Catholic priest and say 3 rosaries if that huge wave coming my way at Newport Beach at age 12 would spare me. And to this day, I have struggled with waves that are 4 feet and higher when I'm out there body surfing or whatever. That might be an example, but it really did impact me in terms of the classic signs of PTSD, avoidance, hypervigilance, and so forth. So those are examples of some things, perhaps, in your own trauma history. Okay, so we have 2 broad goals today, Michelle and I, in our 40 minutes that we have. And I want to start out with a quote from, sobering quote from Romeo Dallaire, who was the UN peacekeeping commander before enduring the Rwandan genocide. Said in an interview about 15 years ago, he said, look guys, speaking to the world community, to all of us, we can't just Pontius Pilate 800,000 people. He invented a verb, Pontius Pilate, basically saying we can't forget and we cannot look the other way, we cannot wash our hands. This is Murambi in south central Rwanda. I've been there recently. Our daughter just finished her Peace Corps term. Our daughter, Peace Corps term, 27 months. This was within like 2 miles walk from her house. And on the 21st of April 1994, the villages around Murambi, this area, the folks were told that there's danger because the war had broke out, the civil war and the atrocities a couple of weeks earlier. Said, come here, it's safe. You're going to be protected on the hilltop in the church. A lot of people gathered, and in the early mornings of the 21st of April 1994, it was surrounded with machetes, grenades, and within 8 hours, between 40,000 and 50,000 Tutsi and Hutu sympathizers were murdered and massacred, and to this day, they have a memorial to remember. It's not morbid, but they want not just say the Rwandan people to remember, but they want the world community to learn from this. Tomorrow is International Day of Remembrance, the 7th of April, for the Tutsis. It's an international day recognized by the United Nations. In Rwanda, it's called Kwibuka. It's Kwibuka 25. It's the 25th anniversary of the start of the genocide. And I've heard Rwanda more than once, and Africa more than once. And I think because of the harrowing, horrific topic and nature we're getting into, it would be good just to pause for a second, if you wouldn't mind, and just remember the victims, which we remember tomorrow, in the Rwandan genocide and all genocides. Lord, use us as instruments of your peace. And help us to pray the devil back to hell, as that movie says. Amen. We have 2 purposes. And the first one is this. We want to overview the global burden of trauma. We want to relate it to major efforts for sustainable development and mental health. What's going on in the global community about sustainable development and mental health? Does trauma figure in the dialogue? Does trauma figure in these massive agendas that are being created and trying to be implemented? And secondly, let's present some core resources from the humanitarian sector specifically, and let's look at these resources through the lens of trauma. For example, does the word trauma even exist in some of these resources and some of these major agendas? What about violence? What about psychosocial? What about mental health? Are these terms that are being incorporated, or are they being overlooked and not included? So two parts. Each one has 3 parts. We'll be overviewing trauma. Michelle will do that. Big T, little t trauma. We'll look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We'll look at the global mental health field and specifically WHO's Mental Health Action Plan. And then we'll get into the humanitarian sector specifically and look at some of the instruments and resources, agendas there. For example, the UN's Agenda for Humanity from 2016, and then the UN Global Compact for Migration, which was just signed by a number of countries in December in Marrakesh, Africa. And then a few other examples as well. Psychological first aid, the core humanitarian standard, the IFRC's World Development Report, and then the ICRC's mental health and psychosocial support efforts. We'll get to some of those. We might not get to all of them, but over to you, sweetie.
I also want to mention that we have on our website the whole PowerPoint with notes. So you don't have to write everything down, or you'll have access to that. Okay. All right. We have only a few photographs in our presentation, and this one I just want you to look at for a minute. I don't know if anyone recognizes where this might be. It's from 2014. Aleppo? It's it's the Yarmouk refugee camp. 2014 people that are exiting, Palestinian refugees. So, Josiah, you were mentioning Palestinians. Yeah, it just you can't even see the throng. And the history of Palestinians in Lebanon, for example, fleeing, just, there have been waves and waves of refugees, Palestinian, that are still in refugee camps and dispersed, summer camps and dispersed locations for decades and decades. And, currently estimates of forcibly displaced people run around approaching 70 million. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that. But what's significant about these Palestinians is they are in the most vulnerable group, or one of the most vulnerable groups of refugees, because they're stateless. And there are many in this Syrian conflict are caught in this stateless position, limbo, where they have no access to things that citizens have: education, healthcare, employment, freedom of movement. So they are one of the most vulnerable groups, and one of the most traumatized groups, I think, as a result. So in this part one, we're starting out with this photograph of all these people, because we might get into some stats about trauma, but we're talking about people and individuals, and all of you know that, so I don't need to really emphasize that. But the global burden, will look at sustainable development goals and global mental health, the global mental health movement that is trying to meet some of, as Kelly was mentioning, the countless need, the overwhelming need. How can we shift tasks and scale up in certain ways? So to begin with, the global burden of trauma, I'll start out with some statistics. The importance of addressing the global burden of psychological trauma can hardly be overestimated. Big picture guesstimates of the current levels of trauma are staggering, running into the hundreds of millions. Trauma adversely affects human development, socioeconomic development, and even peace. And this is from the Global Initiative for Stress and Trauma Treatment. It's a website I'm taking some materials from. We know people that have developed this, and they have some very good resources. But that statement, that last sentence, human development, socioeconomic development, and even peace. Many of you are involved in peace and conflict studies. We realize that everything is linked, this multi-sectorial. That's why it's such a rich table here that we're sitting at together, because you represent many of the sectors that need to collaborate. So we're going to look at 4 types of structural violence in this overview, some statistics, and then estimates of PTSD, and maybe you have some things to add. Can you see this image? I know that it's dark in the light. I don't know if I could flip a light. I just want you to look at it for a minute and be aware of how you're reacting to it. It's the trauma tree. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this image before. Yeah, okay, all right, good. Yeah, trauma darkens people's lives worldwide. Much of trauma remains hidden, especially in the developing world. It's unrecognized, it's undiagnosed, and therefore left untreated. So this trauma tree is, I think, a very powerful visual metaphor of the causes and consequences, the causes, the roots, causes, and the consequences of trauma. It focuses on, and I'll go into this a little bit more, but 4 types of violence: direct violence, natural violence, cultural violence, and structural violence. And those are not discrete categories, they're interwoven and overlapping. But it's a helpful way of conceptualizing trauma and the extent of its consequences. So we see this dying tree, and then I don't know if you can see all the things up there, but productivity, the larger bits: productivity, health, educability, creativity, peace, well-being. It affects all of us, not just parts of us, and It affects whole communities, whole families. So that's the other piece. It's trauma has some toxic ripple effects. It goes through everything. Before violence is quantified, let's look at the first one, direct violence. There are 1.5 billion people that live in countries affected by political or criminal violence and war. 300 million people live amidst violent insecurity. And we're going to hear from you and hear from Tim, especially in these chronic, unstable contexts. 1/3 of all women in the world experience sexual, physical, or other abuse in their lifetime. We're all aware of that. And women are more than twice as likely as men to have PTSD. So these direct violence has many silent emergencies though too. So at the first slide we have the big T, little t. Some of you are probably familiar with that concept, but you know, stress could be bullying at school, at work, divorce, abandonment, neglect. Natural violence, 268 million people are affected annually by natural disasters. And that's one of the biggest causes of displacement and trauma, the natural violence, natural disasters. And then if you think about just the loss of a loved one, we all experience this multiple times in our life. In 2012, that's just one little statistic for 1 year, but 56 million people died. So all around the world, it may be traumatic, it may not be traumatic, but for violence is quantified in continued structural violence. 1.22 billion people live in extreme poverty. And those in extreme poverty, less than $1.50 a day. But then, if you bring it up at $2 a day, then it jumps to 2.4 billion. So, hunger and malnutrition, these are all statistics that we've seen. And I'm just sort of revisiting them because we're trying to say, what is this big picture? Cultural violence, discrimination, oppression, apartheid, colonialism, exploitation, racism, the chronic stresses that may lead to trauma. And many of us are aware of personal stories probably for each of those categories. So, yeah, the ongoing grind of cultural violence that we don't recognize, we don't see it oftentimes. Confronting trauma, Christian worldview and Christian hope. Yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory that He will reveal to us later. For all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who His children really are. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. For we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. So this verse in Romans, we feel is kind of central to our theology, to our obviously, but to how we look at the current state of the world, to all those quantifications and guesstimates of trauma. And we wait eagerly. I think what we have to bring to the table as people of faith, and it's been mentioned already many times, is hope. And as the world becomes more hopeless, even as we work to make it a better place, a more peaceful place, to heal people, to join with what God is already doing, as in Colossians 1, renewing everything through Christ. We bring an undying hope. We bring a different hope. And I'll talk more about that later because we need to start quantifying its and finding evidence for its effect in our work. Kelly, are you going to come up here?
just a couple thoughts related to this verse from Romans. I don't know if you would agree with this, but trauma reminds us that something is very wrong in our world, and it reminds us, as Larry Crabb and others have said, that we're actually meant for a better world. Something inside of us rebels against what we experience. Trauma is everywhere in creation, from the atomic to the cosmic. Something is wrong, even at the molecular, submolecular world. And as Michelle said, Colossians 1 other places, Christ is restoring and will restore all things. Trauma is another way to view the maims and the moans of fallen creation. Wherever the fall goes, trauma follows. So trauma is ubiquitous, historically, multi-generationally, geographically. It's rooted in our genes, rooted in our own souls. I want to talk about two agendas, two major efforts in the, quote, world community that relate to trauma and that I believe need to inform our work. And presenting them. The first one is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. How many people have heard of this? Just to begin with, have you heard of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? How many people have actually read the resolution, the document from 2015 called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development? How many people have at least read through that? Ooh. That's okay. That's okay. You don't have to go to purgatory or whatever. But I'd like to encourage you to read it and to consider it through the lens of trauma, but also through your own work and life. And I want to just walk us through a little bit in a couple of minutes what this is about. This is one of the opening quotes, early quotes. I think it's paragraph 50. Today we're also taking a decision of great historic significance. We resolve to build a better future for all people, including the millions who have been denied the chance to lead decent, dignified, and rewarding lives and to achieve their full human potential. We can be the first generation to succeed at ending poverty, just as we may be the last to have a chance at saving the planet. These are heavy words. What's motivating the people that put this together, and it was really the world community that gave input on this, not just high-level bureaucrats, but there was an online consultative process for a couple of years when people like you and me, youth and others, could come together and say, what is the future we want? What is the world we want? But there was an ongoing, pervasive sense of something is not only wrong, but if we don't change course, we're going to annihilate ourselves as a race. So that's just not some kind of radical preacher apocalyptic vision. This is coming from secular sources. And if you look at our global integration updates, which we send out, 2 years ago we did something called Doomsday, is global disintegration en route. And we use purely secular UN sources to hear what they're saying about what is going to happen if we don't change our course, whether it's climate, whether it's trafficking, whether it's health, and so on and so forth. So this document is birthed out of a sense that something is really wrong and we've got to do something different. World Community identified 17 specific goals. They're called the Sustainable Development Goals. I won't go through all of them, just a couple. The first one is ending poverty in all of its forms. Not just, say, finances, not just, well, I want $3 an hour per capita. But no, multidimensional poverty includes lots of different areas besides just finances. So that's the first one, about poverty, ending poverty in all of its forms. The third one deals with something that concerns all of us, which is the health goal. And I'm going to get into that in a second, about health for all at all ages. And then I'll say this, the 16th one relates to what we're doing too, because that relates to peaceful and inclusive societies. So when you pick this apart, when you study it some more, you see so many opportunities for integration, for connecting, for contributing, and vice versa. And people have different views. We know that about the United Nations, about secular efforts. Everything from, God is at work doing stuff, this is so much of God, all the way to this is a demonic counterfeit. Don't want to go there theologically or practically. We feel quite comfortable, but also critical at the same time as we engage with the United Nations. We do it with an open mind, open heart, but primarily very appreciative in seeing the incredible resources of what these men and women are involved with in doing. So we're very pro, yet with a critical eye. So this third, and the 17th goal is on partnership, which also brings us together. How can we partner together and with other resources, other entities, other emphases out there on behalf of trauma? So SDG 3 is the health goal, And there's 169 targets for 17 Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, and underneath all of these, there's 169 targets, and then underneath the targets, there's indicators. So quantifiable measures to see if we're really meeting our targets and then meeting our goals. 3.4 is the one where mental health is included. Now, this is actually what it says: by 2030, reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular, respiratory, cancers, and so forth, respiratory. Do it through prevention and treatment, and promote mental health and well-being. So the point here is that when we look at these documents that are shaping and impelling the world community forward, we look at them through a trauma lens. We get asked, how much is trauma really on the radar? The word trauma does not exist at all. It does not occur once in the entire document. The word mental occurs many, many times, like governmental, environmental, but mental health per se occurs 2 or 3 times. Violence is used 11 times, and nonviolence is used once. So the point is, how can we find hooks, or little platforms that are there to introduce trauma? Mental health is a good hook, a good word. Violence is a good word, and trauma itself. Psychosocial is a good word in the literature. So it's not like we're coming in with our agenda, but it's there. It's implicit, but it's not often explicit, and we have an opportunity to help inform people, and some of the movers and shakers, about trauma. So it's underused in the major documents, but it's implied many times too. This is another way of looking at some of SDG 3.4, which I just had up on the board. WHO, World Health Organization, has had an approach where they call it the 4x4, but now it's called the 5x5. They look at the major diseases related to non-communicable diseases and the massive pandemic that we have in the world, okay? For all these things, cardiovascular, cancer, diabetes, etc. But they've added mental health to the mix intentionally the last year. And in terms of risk factors, there's, like, say, 5 diseases, even though mental health is not just a disease, we acknowledge that, but for argument's sake, we'll say that right now. But the risk factors that influence all these things: use of tobacco, physical inactivity, unhealthy diet, harmful use of alcohol, and the other one that they've added recently is environmental, that is air pollution, which is just horrific in so many places, and some of us have experienced that before. So this, my point in showing this, infographic is that it provides opportunities for connecting as Christians in our work, because this is a major emphasis, and mental health and trauma, quality of life, well-being is something that we could learn from, but also introduce into these situations. Are you doing this or am I doing this? Okay, I'm shifting gears, and that was a real, I don't want to say horrible, but I was way too fast about Sustainable Development Goals. And I encourage you to look into them. Second broad area we want to introduce is that of global mental health, specifically focused on the World Health Organization's Mental Health Action Plan. This really provides lots of point of contact for trauma, violence, and so forth. And this is our definition that we've been promoting for global mental health for about the last 8 years or so. It's an emerging domain which promotes mental health and well-being for all. So that comes directly from the SDGs, the wording. Global mental health, it's international, interdisciplinary, culturally relevant, multi-sectoral, emphasizes the right to health, equity in health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you will find the word trauma in there as well. It's committed to preventing and treating mental, neurological, substance use conditions, especially for vulnerable populations. That is, settings of poverty, conflict, calamity, and trauma, and so on. So there's the word trauma in there that we included intentionally, and this definition provides great access and a great way to start talking about trauma as we work in global mental health areas. Global mental health is a domain, a field. It really started to gain lots and lots of visibility and coming together cohesively about 2007, 2008, so it's relatively new. Lots of practitioners, and the goal is, among other things, to really reduce the treatment gap between the number of people that have mental, neurological disorders, substance use disorders, and then the types of treatment in different cultures and communities that are effective to help them. So major movement, we're involved with that. And trauma is not quite made its way into the global mental health movement yet. Too many other things we're focusing on, but the causes of mental health conditions increasingly are. And we won't have time to get into that, but they're called social and cultural determinants of health. So it's just not a disease entity that we're talking about, or like a disorder that you see in some nomenclature somewhere, but we're talking about conditions that are affected by poverty, by prejudice, by aggression, by trafficking, and so on. These are things that influence the mental well-being of the universe, and trauma can slot right into that understanding, the causes of trauma, the causes of mental health, and the consequences as well.
Yeah, so we're going to get into now just a little bit more closely at the Mental Health Action Plan that was launched in 2013, and the goal was to try to accomplish some of the targets by 2020, and they just moved it to 2030 because the countries involved were not measuring up fast enough, so they've expanded it. So now it's the Mental Health Action Plan 2013 to 2030. And I'm just going to read the vision statement because I think it really is very well put. A world in which mental health is valued, promoted, and protected. Mental health disorders are prevented, and persons affected by these disorders are able to exercise the full range of human rights and access high quality, culturally appropriate health and social care in a timely way to improve recovery, all in order to attain the highest possible level of health and participate fully in society at work, free from stigmatization and discrimination. So you can see right in there, many of you are involved in areas. There's the themes of prevention, advocacy, protection, the human rights piece, and culturally appropriate. Our vision for this collaborative, a lot of the things that we care about were actually just mentioned in here. And I'd like to say that the world out there cares about mental health as much as we do, and about well-being. And they really are working hard, so we can partner with them. Does anybody want to react to that vision statement? Are there parts of that vision statement that you can really identify with? Maybe you're passionate about certain parts of that vision statement.
I would just say the thing that hits me as I read that, one of the things that's been on my heart in recent years, as I've worked in the ministry community, is that I have a conviction that the church should be the gold standard of emotional health. We are not, but I do think that should be our birthright. We should be, and so I think we should have a place at the table with that kind of vision and voice at the table, because I think we have the foundation of health should be who we are as a church.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be good for us to be helping to shape this vision, and the Mental Health Action Plan and the various other plans and agendas and protocols that their WHO is rolling out in support of this action plan. It's about a booklet. If you were to download it from the WHO website, it'd be about 50 pages. But all the other things that they're rolling out in support of this too need to be adapted culturally. They want people to do that in situ, and and a church, there is such an opportunity. And the watchword central to this whole action plan is there's no health without mental health. You may have heard that. But so that's bringing mental health in parity with global health. So we definitely have
Michelle?
opportunities there.
I just want to comment too, I love the prevention piece.
Yes.
So, value promoted, protected, and that's prevented. And I think this proactive work of promoting health and resilience, and there's so much reactive right now. And so that to me is just so critical.
Yeah, there's some quote about, some preachers has a quote about the pulpit and using the pulpit. And sorry, does anybody know this quote? I'll have to find it. It's great, but it's exactly what you all are saying. It's like we need to have mental health in the pulpit. We need to be talking about it.
I have a,
To prevent things like suicide. That's someone who's been involved a lot with suicide work. That's a lovely example of how we could really destigmatization and discrimination and talk about issues. Yes, please.
I have a question, and this is a weird question coming from a Western white woman. This, to me right now, this statement feels very Western and very white. And my question for you guys is it the reality that people from other cultures that this makes no sense to, are they really part of this process? And are their voices being heard at house? So when we read high quality, culturally appropriate health, it's like, okay,
Yeah, and
I'm having a reaction to that just because.
thank you so much for sharing that reaction. Maybe someone else wants to write on your page too. I am.
May I chime in? Just as I was reading this, I'm sure you've probably done this as part of this process, and I'm thinking of the partners that we have in Kenya and the nuances in the African culture. When you read that word mental health, they just go to something's wrong with me, something spiritual, something demonic. And so with the partner that we have in Nairobi, we use emotional well-being and not mental health. Just,
Right.
yeah.
Thank you both. So these are some of the challenges for scaling up, for adapting. And really, there is that piece. It's clear in this plan that it has to be adapted. And you have to have idioms of distress, like you're mentioning, that make sense within the culture. And so these are principles, and they have to be translated. And that's hard work. That's hard work. And they can't just be, just kind of slapped into our whatever we do. But if we're truly people that are embedded and know what's going on and connecting, the whole idea is that you connect with the local partners, the local people, and the people with lived experience. So one of the cross-cutting themes, I'm not going to get into that for lack of time, but one of the cross-cutting themes in this action plan is evidence, universal health coverage, human rights, evidence-based practice, life course approach, multi-sectoral approach, and then the last one is empowerment of persons with mental disorders and psychosocial disabilities. So they need to be at the table fashioning the policy and giving input. Yes?
I agree that the language may be Western, but I think the goals are very culturally sensitive. Because as I read this, I see this happening in Rwanda. Rwanda has the country organized so that in groups of family groups of 10, there is a health worker. And they have a level of training, and what they can't do, they know how to refer out and get help. So they are providing care in a timely way, and it's culturally appropriate and sensitive. So I think the goals are culturally.
Yeah, and what we've seen over time, about 10 years with this mental health action plan, the rollout, and they have an annual forum that we go to, and it lasts for 2 days, and people from all of the member states that are part of WHO, they are doing the work of this, and they are bringing in, and I'll be talking about a wonderful psychosocial intervention that now has been evidence-based, and some of you may have heard of it later, but that, yeah, I use it.
We're almost,
Yeah.
we are out of time, so we won't be talking about it.
All right, I realize there's another,
I was just gonna say, I think I feel attention where it talks about the timely way and the high quality and culturally appropriate, because oftentimes, especially in disaster settings, that, even though there is scale up, and I'm familiar with some of those social and the different MHGAP interventions, the process to adapt those do not necessarily, correspond with the timeline to provide care and immediate effects of the effects.
thank you, that is duly noted. So that's a challenge and an area of research really of trying to develop things. So, 4 major objectives, I'm going to leave that for you to look at in the PowerPoint later, but it does involve strengthening effective leadership and governance on mental health, so policy, protection, human rights, that's right at the foundation. So only right now about approaching 50% of countries are actually implementing mental health policies in line with human rights policies, or upgrading what they have already. Yeah. All right. So again, we did some word searches, trauma-related words used 7 times, 5 in context of humanitarian settings, and 2 in the context of adverse life events.
We just need to check in on a time, because
Yeah.
when should we got a minute, 2 minutes?
Our
or just-
timekeeper's not here.
Our timekeeper's not here, so,
Because I think we're in the break time right now, actually, right?
break is at 10:45. So we were gonna do our first collaborative group, and we'd like to make that an abbreviated group, so I'm gonna let you choose when to switch. We're gonna stop at 10:15, we're a little over. You can, if you're all okay, we might give you just a 10-minute break, and then we'll, so if you wanna finish up in the next couple minutes, we can give them a 20-minute collaborative group, and then head up for coffee when they finish.
A couple of summary thoughts from my perspective. Nothing like a good video or visual to help put things in perspective. This is one which you might have seen. It's from Mundo organization, Living Peace, the story of Abby and Kayalu in DRC. And it's about 9 minutes, and it looks at what happened to this woman and other people like her, or women like her, and then a culturally appropriate psychological response in the form of like group therapy that was relevant for them. It really has been helpful. And so there's lots of things increasingly coming out like that. And this group, in the background that you have, very perceptive about possible issues. I'm going back to some comments about the Global Mental Health Action Plan, or the global anything, one size fits all. You know, we should be very skeptical about Western approaches, Western diagnostic categories, in our sincere attempt to rush in and a treatment gap. There's 450 million people supposedly in the world currently are suffering from mental neurological substance use conditions. We got to go in there and do something, but do we? Probably the best article I've seen, we've seen, very short, and it's online for free, that gets at some of the major criticisms from more of an anthropological, transcultural psychiatry. You can get it for free. It's in the December 2014 issue of Transcultural Psychiatry. And it's called Towards a New Architecture for Global Mental Health. Very readable. They get into critiques and answers them, very balanced. And by the way, at least the movers and shakers we know, they're very much on board with the criticisms and stuff that we're talking about, and very much aware of the need for evidence-based implementation science to demonstrate the efficacy of our interventions in other cultures.
Kelly, that reference, is it not in something?
What's the
Yeah,
name?
it's in one of the notes, actually.
I was
So
gonna
it's
say.
Transcultural Psychiatry, December 1994.
We have
per
live
Meyer,
links.
from McGill
In the name
University.
of the article?
Towards a New Architecture for Global Mental Health. But it's, all the other articles in this special issue on global mental health are not for free, but the introduction one is. And then my final comment in our presentation, we got through about half, is just a reminder that the humanitarian sector in general is, I would say at this point, much more open to trauma this, trauma that, many points of convergence, contact, I think, as we interact with people like that. They get it. But where we're struggling in the humanitarian sector, we've been doing mental health psychosocial support stuff for years, but can you demonstrate the efficacy? Do we have the personnel? Can we really do this sustainably in these settings where there's chronic trauma or natural disasters, calamities, and so forth? We're understaffed, underexperienced, undersourced, under-resourced, and that continues to be a major issue and challenge for us in the humanitarian sector. Very open, but we've got to responsible. Any final thoughts, Shiva?
Some of the things, maybe I'll end on this because it builds on what you all were saying. And this is the friendship bench. Wait, how long is that? It's 3 minutes. I don't know if there's time to watch this.
It's up to you. It's up to you.
I don't know that we have audio if we showed a 3-minute video or not.
Yeah, we do. I checked. So if I just click on this, Josiah?
Yeah, should work.
The meaning of the song is this: I am amazed with the great work of your hands that you have done for me. Whom shall I tell what is troubling my heart?
I welcome you at this friendship bench, where we help each other by talking.
I just think if I commit suicide, I will rest. Because I've got many problems. Because I'm not okay, things are hard. My husband is dead. No one look after me. Now, as I'm telling you, my kids are at home. No school fees, no food, nothing.
If you want to cry, you can cry. Here, you are free to tell all what is troubling you.
It saved my life to begin with. Like I would have been dead by now. Secondly, I've learned to accept life as it is. These women, they are old and wise, and they have got vast experiences in life. And I don't know, there is this magic about the old women, I get along very well with them.
I'm okay.
Yeah, okay now.
Yeah, I see so.
Yeah, very strong.
Yeah, I'm now a changed man. Since it begins with me, so the change also begins with me. Yeah, I'm living the change. Do you still remember what you said? You told me that I'm a precious gift of God. Thank you, Miss Shiko. I'm now responsible. I'm not a responsible citizen. I'm now a responsible father. How you can so you
Dinosha miswa kwazo na baba samakuru That's my potential. I just want to sing this music. I'm an artist.
If you close another book, there's another book which will be opened. So today we opened a new page. So, Rosemary, I wish you all the happiness.
So that is, this is the young psychiatrist who innovated the Friendship Bench, which is an evidence-based psychosocial intervention. That's a TED Talk. And this intervention, so it is evidence-based. You saw the people of faith sort of involved in that. Some of that came out in what they were expressing or singing. And it's one of the interventions being used to scale up the gap. So it's a problem-solving therapy to increase mental health and well-being. So it's not a treatment for more serious mental health conditions, but prevention, it is very much in the prevention category. And I just want to underscore, I think they're grandfathers too, not just grandmothers, but I love that concept, and it's very simple, but this bench is now making its rounds around the world, coming from Zimbabwe. It was up recently at a ministerial summit to launch a Lancet Commission report on mental health, a landmark report. There's some information in our slides about that. So they had the Friendship Bench there, and it was in London, so the likes of Kate and William were on the bench because they are promoters for mental health. The bench then went to the World Economic Forum, and they had people sitting on the bench because the whole forum was focused on mental health this year in Davos, Switzerland. And you can go and link to all the speakers and the Friendship Bench, and there are many worthwhile mental health programming there that you can hear about. So that bench has been to New York, I think with the UN, and it's making its rounds. So you may find yourself in a place where the bench is. Anyway, thank you very much for your comments, for your input, and we just, I appreciate all of that, with the richness that you bring. Sorry that we didn't get through other slides, but they'll be there if you want to look. I just want to underscore the WHO, World Vision, Trauma Foundation. They have a psychological first aid book you can download in 20 languages. And it is one of the hottest publications in the WHO. It's a mental health and psychological and social intervention, not to overtake all the other interventions in that category. But it's a very good one that could be used in churches and outreach right here. We've had mission teams from our sending church saying, we got to get a hold of that, to the Oxnard area. And disaster relief, it also is something that they're using in the humanitarian field to build up resilience for teams. So it's almost like there's a wide rollout. Everybody get this tool, training, non-professionals can be trained in it, and then they are ready when it's needed. And it builds resistance and then as also people. Resilience. Resistance? Resilience. So resilience building tools for prevention as well as intervention right after disaster or emergency.
Oh my word, there's way too much. So we have been short on time. I'm gonna make a suggestion, Kelly, if this is good for you. Our break was scheduled at 10:45. We're gonna say if you need to run to the restroom, run up and grab a cup of, well, you'll just know how you wanna do the collaborative. Can we do short collaborative groups? Is that workable?
Up to you.